Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, Vance Brand, Alexei Leonov, and Valery Kubasov, the 5 men who made space history with the successful joint flight of Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft. From the Soviet Union's launch complex in the province of Kazakhstan, the Soyuz spacecraft was launched first. Then, 7.5 hours later, the Apollo aboard a Saturn 1B launch vehicle blasted off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Into Earth orbit within 10 minutes, the first major step taken by the Apollo crew was to separate from its second stage launch vehicle and make a transposition maneuver. The Apollo slowly moves in on the docking module, which was contained in an adapter on the forward portion of the launch vehicle using the probe and drogue system utilized on all previous Apollo Skylab flights. First, there was a soft docking in which 3 capture latches hook up, and moments later 12 latches were activated to secure and seal the 2 vehicles together. Then the extraction. The docking module, some 10 feet in length and 5 feet in diameter, is the airlock tunnel between the Apollo and Soyuz, which permits transfer of the crews. In addition, the docking module contains scientific experiment packages which the astronauts activated during the later stages of the flight. Right on schedule, the sighting and rendezvous of the Soyuz spacecraft takes place a little less than 2 days after the launch. The altitude about 140 miles above the Atlantic Ocean just east of Brazil. Using a T-target, Vance Brand pilots the Apollo toward the Soyuz. This is the first flight test of a universal docking system. The Soviets built their unit, Rockwell International built the American system, and while different in some aspects, they are compatible. The Apollo pilot is looking out of the left rendezvous window of his spacecraft. At close range, he cannot see the actual docking equipment, only the target. Apollo Commander Tom Stafford, followed by Deke Slayton, entered the docking module. Stafford confirmed that the docking latches functioned and the 2 spacecraft were sealed. Later, he began to remove the hatch. Simultaneously, Leonov was removing the Soyuz hatch. Stafford and Slayton had been in the docking module approximately 30 minutes before the hatches were opened. It takes that time to pressurize from 5 psi to the 10 psi of the Soyuz, and to also obtain a 2-gas nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. Fixed television cameras in the docking module beamed back to Earth. Via the ATS-6 satellite, the historic meeting of the American and Soviet spacemen, and the handshakes. First Leonov with Stafford, then Leonov with Slayton. The spacemen shared their food. All of the Americans had eaten borscht, but this was the first time they had eaten borscht from a tube labeled vodka. During the joint operations, they shared food, but each admitted later that they preferred their own. Early in the space program, American astronaut crews dined from plastic bags containing dehydrated or freeze-dried meals reconstituted with water. This was improved in the Apollo spacecraft, which had hot water and warm meals. And in the long-duration missions of Skylab, which had an oven, the meals were similar to Earthbound TV dinners. In their first get-together, the American and Soviet crews exchanged a variety of gifts. Leonov had special medallions for Stafford, Slayton, and Brand. And there were tie clasps, replicas of the Apollo-Soyuz spacecraft docked together. And down on Earth, for the first time, millions of television-viewing Soviet citizens were watching the effects of weightlessness. Everything floats. Leonov lets the medallion drift in space. Naturally, there were more than social exchanges. During the 2 days of link-up, the crews performed 5 joint experiments, held a press conference, and generally checked out the characteristics of both spacecraft systems. During the joint operations, the Soviet crew spoke English, while the Americans spoke Russian, and one crew member always remained in his spacecraft while the others worked or ate their meals in the other spacecraft. Stafford had 3 times previously flown in space. Both Leonov and Kubasov had also flown in space, but for Slayton and Brand, they were experiencing weightlessness for the first time. For the National Archives of both countries, the spacecraft commanders, Stafford and Leonov, signed flight certificates attesting to the success of the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. All aspects of the flight were successful, and all mission requirements were met. Stafford explains flight controls and systems procedures for the Apollo spacecraft with Leonov. Stafford is in the foreground middle seat, while the Soviet cosmonaut takes the left seat, which is normally the position of the spacecraft commander. One of the joint experiments was for the Apollo to fly an eclipse with the sun, while the Soyuz crew photographed the resulting light phenomenon. The Apollo spacecraft, following separation at the conclusion of the 2 days of joint operations, had just completed the eclipse maneuver, and both crews filmed each other as the Apollo flew around the Soyuz. The Soyuz returned to its Earth landing, and the Apollo orbited for another 5 days, performing experiments in the fields of Earth resources, astronomy, manufacturing, and biomedicine before it returned to a successful landing northeast of Hawaii.